In the spring of 1945, British soldiers liberated Bergen-Belsen concentration camp and discovered 10,000 unburied corpses scattered across the mud. Among 45 staff members arrested that day, 21 were women. 6 months later, when a British military tribunal delivered its verdicts in a bombed-out courthouse in Lüneburg, 3 women stood condemned to hang. Irma Grese was 22 years old. Elisabeth Volkenrath was 26. Juana Bormann was 52. On December 13, 1945, all 3 were executed at Hamelin Prison. They became the first female concentration camp personnel to die on the gallows in the post-war trials. They would not be the last. What shattered the Allied prosecutors, the press, and the public was not simply the brutality these women had inflicted. It was the violation of every assumption about what women were supposed to be. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the war forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The shock began at the moment of arrest. When British troops entered Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, they expected to confront male SS officers. What they found operating alongside Commandant Joseph Kramer were dozens of women in gray uniforms carrying whips and truncheons, walking among the dying with administrative efficiency. 21-year-old Irma Grese tried to attack a British officer who entered one of the barracks. She was immediately restrained, her arrogance intact, even as thousands of skeletal prisoners watched. For soldiers raised in societies where women represented nurses, mothers, and moral guardians, the presence of female perpetrators was cognitively dissonant. Women were not supposed to wield power this way. They were not supposed to beat prisoners with leather straps. They were not supposed to select human beings for gas chambers with the same clinical detachment a clerk might sort mail. The traditional roles defined by German society for decades, the so-called 4 Ks, Kinder, Kirche, Küche, Kleider, children, church, kitchen, clothing, had prepared no one for what these women had become. The path to the gallows began not in the camps, but in the laboratories and hospitals of Nazi Germany. Years before the first extermination camp opened, German medical professionals pioneered a program that would normalize killing as therapeutic intervention. Action T4, named for the address at Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin, where the operation was coordinated, targeted the mentally ill, the physically disabled, and children deemed unfit to live. Between 1939 and 1941, over 70,000 German citizens were murdered in 6 killing centers across the Reich. Doctors wrote the orders. Nurses administered the lethal injections. The program required precision, documentation, and a veneer of medical legitimacy. Women were essential to that facade. Nursing had always been coded as feminine work, an extension of maternal care. The Nazi regime exploited that association. Nurses like Pauline Kneisler worked at Hadamar Euthanasia Center, where at least 10,000 people were killed. She later traveled to the Eastern Front, where she admitted to murdering wounded German soldiers she deemed beyond recovery. Her role was not passive assistance. It was active participation in medicalized mass murder. The euthanasia program became the training ground for the Holocaust. The personnel, the methods, the bureaucratic structures all migrated from T4 centers to concentration camps. By 1942, women who had killed in the name of mercy were transferred to camps where mercy no longer existed. Ravensbruck concentration camp, opened in 1939 north of Berlin, was the only major Nazi camp built specifically for women. It also served as the primary training facility for female guards. Some 3,500 women passed through Ravensbruck's training program between 1939 and 1945. They learned how to conduct roll calls, how to enforce discipline, how to select prisoners for labor details or death. They were called Aufseherinnen, female overseers, and they were not members of the SS. Women could not join the Schutzstaffel, They were classified as SS Gefolge, SS retinue, auxiliary personnel without official rank. This technicality would matter later when defense attorneys argued their clients had no real authority, no real power. But in the camps, power was measured by access to violence, and the Officerinnen had that in abundance. Hertha Oberhäuser arrived at Ravensbruck in 1940 as a physician, not a guard. She had earned her medical degree from the University of Bonn in 1937, specializing in dermatology. She joined the Nazi Party as an intern and wrote anti-Semitic tracts that would later be entered as evidence against her. At Ravensbruck, she assisted SS surgeon Karl Gebhardt in conducting grotesque experiments on Polish political prisoners. 86 women were subjected to deliberately infected wounds, amputations, and bone removal, all without anesthesia. 5 died. The survivors were left crippled. Oberhäuser selected the victims, infected the wounds, and assisted in surgeries. Witnesses recalled her mixing water with vinegar before giving it to patients, refusing pain medication, making wounds worse through deliberate neglect. She would later claim that Germans had the right to experiment on members of the Polish resistance. Her medical training, the Hippocratic Oath, the principles of informed consent, none of it mattered once ideology superseded ethics. By 1943, the camp system had metastasized. Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest extermination complex in Nazi-occupied Europe, required staff to manage the industrial-scale killing of over 1 million people. Female guards were transferred from Ravensbruck to oversee the women's sections of Birkenau. Irma Grese arrived in March 1943, 20 years old, blonde, described by survivors as beautiful. She rose quickly through the ranks, becoming Oberaufseherin, senior overseer, by the age of 20. Her weapons were a rubber truncheon, a pistol, and a braided whip. Survivor testimonies described her walking through the barracks, selecting women for the gas chambers with casual efficiency. She beat prisoners who tried to flee selection parades. She forced inmates to perform strenuous exercises as punishment, exercises known as making sport that left them too exhausted to stand. Dr. Gisela Perl, a Jewish physician forced to work in the camp hospital, wrote that Grese experienced sexual arousal while watching her operate on prisoners whose breasts had been slashed by Grese's whip and infected with lice or dirt. Perl operated with only a knife, no anesthesia, while Grese watched and kicked the screaming patient if the noise interfered with her pleasure. This was not the random sadism of an untrained brute. It was calculated, sexualized cruelty performed by someone who understood exactly what she was doing. The medical staff operated with a different kind of violence. Maria Mandel, head of the female guards at Auschwitz-Birkenau, was an intelligent, cultured woman who loved classical music. She encouraged the formation of the Women's Orchestra at Auschwitz, which played during roll calls, arrivals of transports, and executions. The music provided a surreal soundtrack to genocide. Mandel was known among prisoners as the Beast for her role in selecting women and children for the gas chambers. She did not personally kill anyone with her hands. She did not need to. Her selections sent tens of thousands to their deaths. In the camp hierarchy, this administrative violence was considered less visceral, more professional, but the result was identical. Nurses worked in camp hospitals, places that bore the name of healing, but functioned as sites of murder. At Ravensbruck, head nurse Elisabeth Marshall, nearly 61 years old, selected sick prisoners for the gas chambers and participated in medical experiments. She had trained as a nurse in 1909, decades before the Nazi Party existed. Her professional life spanned the transition from Weimar Republic to Third Reich, and somewhere in that transformation, the ethics of care had been replaced by the logic of extermination. When the Allied armies advanced in early 1945, the SS began evacuating the camps. Ravensbruck held over 45,000 female prisoners and 5,000 male prisoners by January. In late April, SS guards forced 20,000 women on brutal marches toward northern Mecklenburg. Many died on the roads. Soviet forces intercepted the columns and liberated the survivors. On April 30th, Soviet troops entered Ravensbruck and found over 2,000 sick prisoners left behind. Bergen-Belsen, farther west, fell to the British. Between 1939 and 1945, more than 130,000 women had passed through the Ravensbruck system. Between 20,000 and 30,000 died there. When the liberators arrived, they documented everything: photographs, testimonies, medical records. The evidence was overwhelming, and the arrests began immediately. The British authorities were determined to move quickly. The Bergen-Belsen trial, formerly known as the trial of Josef Kramer and 44 others, opened on September 17, 1945, in Lüneburg, 2 months before the International Military Tribunal began in Nuremberg. 45 defendants sat in the dock, each wearing a number on their chest. 24 were men, 21 were women. The British prosecutors argued 3 main points. First, that every action at Belsen and Auschwitz violated the Geneva Conventions, and that complete disregard for the sanctity of human life made every staff member responsible, from commandant to the lowest-ranking capo. Second, that all deaths, whether caused by beatings, shootings, gassings, or starvation, were intentional and therefore constituted murder. Third, that individual responsibility existed within a criminal system, and participation in that system was itself a crime. The prosecution was clear that Jews were targeted and killed because they were Jewish. This was not a matter of military necessity or legitimate warfare. It was genocide. The defense strategies varied. Most defendants invoked superior orders, claiming they had no choice but to follow commands from above. Others acknowledged crimes but denied personal involvement, challenging witness memory and the reliability of survivor testimony. A few argued that British courts had no jurisdiction over crimes against non-Allied nationals, attempting to exclude Polish and Hungarian Jewish victims from consideration. The female defendants employed an additional defense. They were women. They had no real authority. They were merely following the orders of male superiors in a military hierarchy they did not create and could not refuse. Irma Grese stated at trial that Heinrich Himmler was responsible for everything, but she supposed she was as much to blame as those above her. Her tone was dismissive. She responded to questions with irritation. When asked about her dog, she snapped, "I should know better than you whether or not I had a dog, don't you think?" When prosecutors repeatedly used the word regularly to describe her beatings of prisoners, she said, "I wish you would stop repeating the word regularly." Only when her sister Helene testified about a violent confrontation between Irma and their father in 1943 did Grese break down sobbing. It was her sole moment of vulnerability in a trial defined by cold detachment. On November 16, 1945, after 54 days of testimony from over 100 witnesses, the verdicts were delivered. 31 defendants were found guilty, 14 were acquitted, 11 were sentenced to death. Among them were Josef Kramer, the Beast of Belsen, and 3 women, Juana Bormann, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Irma Grese. The sentences were carried out on December 13, 1945, at Hamelin Prison. Albert Pierrepoint, the British executioner, hanged them at 30-minute intervals. Elisabeth Volkenrath went first at 9:34 a.m. Irma Grese followed at 10:03 a.m. Juana Bormann was last at 10:38 a.m. Grese's final word was schnell, quick. She had been sobbing in her cell before the execution. She was 22 years old, the youngest woman to die judicially under British law in the 20th century. The men were hanged in pairs afterward. All 13 executions were completed by 4:17 p.m. The condemned had been held in cells along a corridor with the execution chamber at the end. Each must have heard the trapdoor open, the rope snap taut, the silence that followed. Then it was their turn. The Ravensbruck trials began in December 1946 in Hamburg, more than a year after Belsen. 7 separate trials were held between 1946 and 1948, involving 38 defendants. 21 were women. The first trial sentenced 11 defendants to death, including 5 women. Dorothea Binz, 27 years old, had been Oberaufseherin at Ravensbruck. Elizabeth Marshall, the head nurse, was nearly 61. Greta Bösel, 39, supervised labor details. Carmen Mori, a Swiss-born capo who had spied for the French, the Nazis, and the British, cut her wrists in her cell on April 9, 1947, with a razor blade hidden in her shoe. She bled out before the sentence could be carried out. Vera Salvaquart, 28, a Czech prisoner who worked as a nurse and allegedly poisoned 50 patients with white powder, was hanged on June 2, 1947, after her appeal for clemency based on espionage for Britain was rejected. The remaining women were executed on May 2 and May 3, 1947. In the doctor's trial at Nuremberg, Hertha Oberhäuser was the only female defendant among 23 accused. She was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity and sentenced to 20 years. The sentence was commuted to 10 years in January 1951. She was released in April 1952 after serving just 5 years. She returned to Germany, opened a medical practice in Stocksee, and worked as a family doctor until 1958, when a Ravensbruck survivor recognized her. Her medical license was revoked, and she never practiced again. She died in 1978. The Stutthof trials in Poland demonstrated the range of post-war justice. 11 defendants, including 5 women, were publicly hanged on July 4, 1946, before a crowd of several thousand at Biskupia Gorka Hill near Danzig. Simple cord nooses were placed around their necks. They were made to stand on truck tailboards. The trucks drove forward, leaving them suspended. They were not hooded. They received a short drop. Some struggled for several minutes. The event was photographed by official press photographers. Jenny Wanda Barkman, 24, known as the Beautiful Spectre, had flirted with male guards during her trial and reportedly remarked after her death sentence, "Life is a pleasure, and pleasure, as a rule, is a short distance." Elizabeth Becker was 22. Wanda Klaff was 24. Gerda Steinhoff was 24. Iwa Paradis was 25. They had worked at Stutthof for less than a year. Their youth did not mitigate their crimes. Their gender did not save them. In Krakow, Maria Mandel and Therese Brandel, former Aufseherinnen at Auschwitz, were hanged on January 24, 1948, alongside 19 male defendants. They were executed in groups on short drop gallows. It took 15 minutes for death to be confirmed. Their bodies were sent to the medical school at the University of Krakow for anatomical dissection. The statistics reveal a stark pattern. Approximately 3,600 women worked in Nazi concentration camps. Around 60 were tried in war crimes tribunals. Of those, 21 were executed. The execution rate for female defendants was proportionally higher than for male defendants in equivalent positions. At the Belsen trial, 3 of the 11 death sentences were handed to women, representing 27% of those executed, despite women comprising less than half the defendants. In the Hamburg-Ravensbruck trials, 20 of 38 defendants were sentenced to death, and more than half of those executed were women. Male defendants in comparable roles, guards, administrators, functionaries, received prison sentences or acquittals at higher rates. SS doctors who ordered experiments received death sentences, but male guards who carried out beatings often received 10 or 15 years. Female guards who committed similar acts were more likely to hang. The reasons for this disparity were rooted in gender expectations that transcended law. Women were judged not only for what they had done, but for the violation of societal assumptions about femininity. Prosecutors and judges operated within cultural frameworks that viewed male violence as regrettable but comprehensible, an extension of military masculinity, warrior culture, the aggressive instincts of men in uniform. Female violence, by contrast, was monstrous precisely because it was unexpected. Women were mothers, caregivers, nurses. They were supposed to embody compassion, gentleness, moral restraint. When they instead embodied cruelty, the response was visceral disgust. Press coverage amplified this. British and American newspapers described Irma Grese as the blonde beast, the beautiful beast, the bitch of Belsen. The juxtaposition of beauty and brutality was endlessly repeated. Maria Mandel's love of classical music was presented as evidence of moral perversity, as if appreciation for Brahms made her crimes more incomprehensible. Male defendants were rarely sexualized in this way. Joseph Kramer was the beast of Belsen, but his appearance, his hobbies, his personal life were not subjects of fascination. The female defendants were scrutinized for their femininity, their lack of femininity, their violations of feminine norms. They were held to a standard of behavior that men were never expected to meet. And when they failed that standard, the punishment was swift and severe. This was not justice. It was moral panic codified into legal verdicts. The crimes committed by female concentration camp personnel were identical to those committed by their male counterparts. Beatings, selections for gas chambers, theft of food, sexual abuse, medical experimentation. The suffering inflicted was the same, the intent was the same, the outcomes were the same. But the perception was different, and perception shaped sentencing. Male defendants could argue they were soldiers following orders in a military hierarchy. Female defendants could not make that argument successfully because they were not soldiers, not members of the SS, not official participants in the chain of command. They were auxiliaries, retinue, support staff. And yet they wielded lethal power every day. This contradiction made them uniquely vulnerable at trial. They had all the responsibility of authority without the institutional protections that might have shielded men in equivalent roles. The legacy of these trials extends beyond the individuals executed. They established precedents that shaped how female perpetrators of atrocities would be prosecuted in subsequent conflicts. The recognition that women could commit war crimes, that gender did not exempt someone from criminal liability, was a necessary legal development. But the disproportionate sentencing, the sexualization of female defendants, the focus on their violations of traditional femininity rather than their violations of human rights, these elements revealed the limits of post-war justice. The tribunals were not designed to interrogate gender as a category of analysis. They were designed to punish individuals for specific acts. And in that framework, women who killed were judged more harshly than men who killed, not because their crimes were worse, but because their crimes were more disturbing to a public that could not reconcile femininity with violence. By 1949, the major trials had concluded. Hundreds of Nazi personnel had been convicted. Dozens had been executed. Thousands more escaped prosecution entirely, fleeing to South America, the Middle East, or simply disappearing into post-war Europe's displaced populations. Herta Oberhäuser practiced medicine for 6 years after her release before a survivor's testimony ended her career. Many female guards received shorter sentences and were quietly released in the 1950s. The Cold War reshaped priorities. West Germany needed to be rebuilt as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. Denazification gave way to reintegration. War criminals became civil servants, teachers, doctors. The women who had worked in the camps returned to ordinary lives. Some married, some had children, some never spoke of what they had done. Others defended it until they died. The question remains, what turned these women into participants in genocide? Was it ideology, the total belief in Nazi racial doctrine, and the promise of a 1,000-year Reich? Was it careerism, the opportunity for advancement unavailable in civilian life? Was it sadism, Latent cruelty unleashed by a system that rewarded brutality and punished mercy? The answer is likely all three, in varying proportions. Irma Grese joined the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls, with pride. Herta Oberhäuser wrote anti-Semitic tracts as a medical student. They believed in the ideology before they entered the camps. But belief alone does not explain the transformation from ordinary citizen to killer. The camps provided permission. They removed consequences. They normalized violence through repetition, bureaucracy, and collective participation. When everyone around you is beating prisoners, when your superiors reward cruelty and punish compassion, when the regime defines your victims as subhuman, resistance requires extraordinary moral courage. Most people do not possess that courage. Most people conform. The tragedy of the female concentration camp personnel is not that they were monsters. It is that they were human. They made choices within a system designed to reward the worst choices, and they chose power, survival, and complicity over resistance. They were nurses who abandoned healing. They were guards who weaponized authority. They were women who proved that gender does not determine capacity for evil. The dark reason Nazi nurses faced worse fates than soldiers was not that their crimes were objectively worse. It was that their crimes violated the foundational myths of civilization about what women are and what women do. Men kill in war. Men commit atrocities. This is tragic but expected. Women are supposed to prevent atrocities, to care for the wounded, to represent the moral limits that men at war might forget. When women instead administered the poison, selected the victims, inflicted the pain, they shattered that illusion. And when the trials concluded, when the verdicts were read and the sentences carried out, the punishment was designed not only to hold individuals accountable, but to restore the myth. The executions of Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, Juana Bormann, Dorothea Binz, Maria Mandel, and all the others who died on the gallows were necessary not just for justice, but for psychological reassurance. The hanging said, "This was an aberration. Women are not like this." These women were exceptions, anomalies, monsters in human form. The trials allowed post-war society to believe that normalcy could be restored, that women would return to their traditional roles, that the moral order had been briefly disrupted, but was now repaired. But the truth documented in trial transcripts, survivor testimonies, and execution records tells a different story. The capacity for cruelty is not gendered. Authority corrupts regardless of who wields it. And when a system is built to facilitate mass murder, ordinary people of all genders will participate, rationalize, and continue until someone stops them. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.